List of music genres and styles. This is a list of music genres and styles. Music can be described in terms of many genres and styles. Classifications are often arbitrary, and may be disputed, and closely related forms often overlap. Larger genres and styles comprise more specific subcategories. Classical music has been around for thousands of years, and has influenced every type of music that came after. Any person who claims to like music should know at the very least, Johann Sebastian Bach, Vivaldi, or Rousseau. I won't be including samples of the music in the videos, for copyright reasons. I hope you enjoy the article.
Please excuse any mispronunciations by TTS. The English TTS has trouble with non-English words. But, if you watch Zentreya, you should be fine. As a result of YouTube's rules pertaining to links in descriptions, I will be adding site details to the video. Romantic music is a stylistic movement in Western classical music associated with the period of the 19th century commonly referred to as the Romantic era or Romantic period. It is closely related to the broader concept of Romanticism, the intellectual, artistic, and literary movement that became prominent in Western culture from about 1798 until 1837. Romantic composers sought to create music that was individualistic, emotional, dramatic, and often programmatic, reflecting broader trends within the movements of Romantic literature, poetry, art, and philosophy. Romantic music was often ostensibly inspired by non-musical stimuli, such as nature, literature, poetry, supernatural elements, or the fine arts. It included features such as increased chromaticism and moved away from traditional forms. The Romantic movement was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in the second half of the 18th century in Europe and strengthened in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. In part, it was a revolt against social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment and a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. It was embodied most strongly in the visual arts, music, literature, and education, and was in turn influenced by developments in natural history. One of the first significant applications of the term to music was in 1789, in the memoirs by the Frenchman André Grétry, but it was E.T.A. Hoffmann who established the principles of musical romanticism, in a lengthy review of Ludwig van Beethoven's Fifth Symphony published in 1810, and an 1813 article on Beethoven's instrumental music. In the first of these essays, Hoffmann traced the beginnings of musical romanticism to the later works of Haydn and Mozart. It was Hoffmann's fusion of ideas already associated with the term romantic, used in opposition to the restraint and formality of classical models, that elevated music, and especially instrumental music, to a position of preeminence in Romanticism as the art most suited to the expression of emotions. It was also through the writings of Hoffmann and other German authors that German music was brought to the center of musical romanticism. The classical period often used short, even fragmentary, thematic material, while the Romantic period tended to make greater use of longer, more fully defined and more emotionally evocative themes. Characteristics often attributed to Romanticism: a new preoccupation with and surrender to nature. A turn towards the mystic and supernatural, both religious and unearthly. A focus on the nocturnal, the ghostly, the frightful, and terrifying. A new attention given to national identity. Discontent with musical formulas and conventions. A greater emphasis on melody to sustain musical interest. Increased chromaticism, a harmonic structure based on movement from tonic to subdominant or alternative keys rather than the traditional dominant, and use of more elaborate harmonic progressions. Wagner and Liszt are known for their experimental progressions. Large, grand orchestras were common during this period. Increase in virtuosic players featured in orchestrations. The use of new or previously not so common musical structures like the song cycle, nocturne, concert etude, arabesque, and rhapsody, alongside the traditional classical genres. Program music became somewhat more common. The use of a wider range of dynamics, for example from PPP to FFF, supported by large orchestration. A greater tonal range. In music, there is a relatively clear dividing line in musical structure and form following the death of Beethoven. Whether one counts Beethoven as a romantic composer or not, the breadth and power of his work gave rise to a feeling that the classical sonata form and, indeed, the structure of the symphony, sonata, and string quartet had been exhausted. During the Romantic period, music often took on a much more nationalistic purpose. Composers composed with a distinct sound that represented their home country and traditions. For example, Jean Sibelius' Finlandia has been interpreted to represent the rising nation of Finland, which would someday gain independence from Russian control. Frédéric Chopin was one of the first composers to incorporate nationalistic elements into his compositions. Joseph Moklas states, Poland's struggle for freedom from Tsarist rule aroused the national poet in Poland. Examples of musical nationalism abound in the output of the Romantic era. The folk idiom is prominent in the mazurkas of Chopin. His mazurkas and polonaises are particularly notable for their use of nationalistic rhythms. Moreover, during World War II the Nazis forbade the playing of Chopin's polonaises in Warsaw because of the powerful symbolism residing in these works. Other composers, such as Bedřich Smetana, wrote pieces that musically described their homelands. In particular, Smetana's Vltava is a symphonic poem about the Moldor River in the modern-day Czech Republic, the second in a cycle of 6 nationalistic symphonic poems collectively titled Má vlast. Smetana also composed 8 nationalist operas, all of which remain in the repertory. They established him as the first Czech nationalist composer as well as the most important Czech opera composer of the generation who came to prominence in the 1860s. The transition of Viennese classicism to Romanticism can be found in the work of Ludwig van Beethoven. Many typically romantic elements are encountered for the first time in his works. These works stand here in contrast to vocal music and are purely instrumental music. According to Hoffmann, the pure instrumental music of Viennese classical music, especially that of Beethoven, since it is free of material or program, is the embodiment of the Romantic art idea. Another one of the most important representatives of late classicism and early Romanticism is Franz Schubert. Because only with him did Romantic features come into the German-language opera with his chamber music works and later also symphonies. In this field, his work is supplemented by the ballads of Karl Loewe. Carl Maria von Weber is important for the development of the German opera, especially with his popular Frühschoats. In addition, there are fantastic Horace materials by Heinrich Marschner and finally the cheerful opera by Albert Lortzing, while Louis Spar became known mainly for his instrumental music. Still largely attached to classical music is the work of Johann Nepomuk Hummel, Ferdinand Ries, and the Frenchman Georges Ancelot. Italy experienced the heyday of the bel canto opera in early Romanticism, associated with the names of Gioacchino Rossini, Gaetano Donizetti, and Vincenzo Bellini. While Rossini's comic operas are primarily known today, often only through their rousing overtures, Donizetti and Bellini predominate tragic content. The most important Italian instrumental composer of this time was the legendary Devil's violinist Niccolò Paganini. In France, on the one hand, the light opera comique developed. Its representatives are François-Adrien Boieldieu, Daniel François Esprit Aubert, and Adolphe Adam, the latter also known for his ballets. One can also quote the famous eccentric composer and harpist Robert Nicolas Charles Boxa. In addition, the Grand Opera came up with pompous stage sets, ballets, and large choirs. Her first representative was Gaspare Spontini, her most important Giacomo Meyerbeer. Music development has now also taken an upswing in other European countries. The Irishman John Field composed the first nocturnes for piano. Friedrich Kuhlau worked in Denmark and the Swede Franz Beerwald wrote 4 very idiosyncratic symphonies. The High Romanticism can be divided into 2 phases. In the first phase, the actual Romantic music reaches its peak. The Polish composer Frédéric Chopin explored previously unknown depths of emotion in his character pieces and dances for piano. Robert Schumann, mentally immersed at the end of his life, represents in person as well as in music almost the prototype of the passionate Romantic artist, shadowed by tragedy. His idiosyncratic piano pieces, chamber music works and symphonies should have a lasting influence on the following generation of musicians. Franz Liszt, who came from the German minority in Hungary, was on the one hand a swarmed piano virtuoso, but on the other hand also laid the foundation for the progressive New German school with his harmoniously bold symphonic poems. Also committed to program music was the technique of the idées fixes of the Frenchman Hector Berlioz, who also significantly expanded the orchestra. Felix Mendelssohn was again more oriented towards the classicist formal language and became a role model especially for Scandinavian composers such as the Dane Niels Wilhelm Gade. In opera, the operas of Otto Nicolai and Friedrich von Flotow still dominated in Germany when Richard Wagner wrote his first romantic operas. The early works of Giuseppe Verdi were also still based on the bel canto ideal of the older generation. In France, the opera lyric was developed by Ambroise Thomas and Charles Gounod. Russian music found its own language in the operas of Mikhail Glinka and Alexander Dargomyskyi. The second phase of High Romanticism runs in parallel with the style of realism in literature and the visual arts. In the second half of his creation, Wagner now developed his leitmotif technique, with which he holds together the four-part ring of the Nibelungen, composed without arias. The orchestra is treated symphonically, the chromaticism reaches its extreme in Tristan and Isolde. A whole crowd of disciples is under the influence of Wagner's progressive ideas, among them, for example, Peter Cornelius. On the other hand, an opposition arose from numerous more conservative composers, to whom Johannes Brahms, who sought a logical continuation of classical music in symphony, chamber music, and song, became a model of scale due to the depth of the sensation and a masterful composition technique. Among others, Robert Volkmann, Friedrich Kiel, Karl Reinecke, Max Bruch, Joseph Gabriel Reinberger, and Hermann Goetz are included in this party. In addition, some important loners came on the scene, among whom Anton Bruckner particularly stands out. Although a Wagner supporter, his clear form style differs significantly from that of that composer. For example, the block-based instrumentation of Bruckner's symphonies is derived from the registers of the organ. In the ideological struggle against Wagner's adversaries, he was portrayed by his followers as a counterpart of Brahms. Felix Draeseke, who originally wrote future music in classical form starting from Liszt, also stands between the parties in composition. Verdi also reached the way to a well-composed musical drama, albeit in a different way than Wagner. His immense charisma made all other composers fade in Italy, including Amilcare Ponchielli and Arrigo Boito, who was also the librettist of his late operas Otello and Falstaff. In France, on the other hand, the light muse triumphed first in the form of the socio-critical operettas of Jacques Offenbach. Lyrical opera found its climax in the works of Jules Massenet, while in the Carmen by Georges Bizet, realism came for the first time. Louis Theodore Gouvi built a stylistic bridge to German music. The operas, symphonies and chamber music works of the extremely versatile Camille Saint-Saëns were, as were the ballets of Leo Delibes, more tradition-oriented. New orchestra colors were found in the compositions of Edouard Lalo and Emmanuel Chabrier. The Belgian-born César Franck was accompanied by a revival of organ music, which was continued by Charles-Marie Weider, later Louis Vierne and Charles Tournemeyer. A specific national romanticism had by now emerged in almost all European countries. The national Russian current started by Glinka was continued in Russia by the group of five Mili Balakhirev, Alexander Borodin, Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Cesar Cui. More Western-oriented were Anton Rubinstein and Peter Tchaikovsky, whose ballets and symphonies gained great popularity. Bedřich Smetana founded Czech national music with his operas and the symphony poems oriented towards Liszt. The symphonies, concerts, and chamber music works of Antonin Dvorak, on the other hand, have Brahms as a model. In Poland, Stanislaw Moniuszko was the leading opera composer, in Hungary Ferenc Erkel. Norway produced its best-known composers with Edvard Grieg, creator of lyrical piano works, songs and orchestral works such as the Peer Gynt Suite. England's voice resonated with the Brahms-oriented Hubert Parry and Symphonist, as well as the comic operas of Arthur Sullivan. In late Romanticism, also called post-Romanticism, the traditional forms and elements of music are further dissolved. An increasingly colorful orchestral palette, an ever-increasing range of musical means, the spread of tonality to its limits, exaggerated emotions, and an increasingly individual tonal language of the individual composer are typical features. The music is led to the threshold of modernity. Thus, the symphonies of Gustav Mahler reached previously unknown dimensions, partly give up the traditional four-sentence and often contain vocal proportions. But behind the monumental facade is the modern expressiveness of the fin de siècle. This psychological expressiveness is also contained in the songs of Hugo Wolf, miniature dramas for voice and piano. More committed to tradition, particularly oriented towards Bruckner, are the symphonies of Franz Schmidt and Richard Wetz, while Max Reger resorted to Bach's polyphony in his numerous instrumental works, but developed it harmoniously extremely boldly. Among the numerous composers of the Reger successor, Julius Weissmann and Joseph Haas stand out. Among the outstanding late Romantic sound creators is also the idiosyncratic Hans Pfitzner. Although a traditionalist and decisive opponent of modern currents, quite a few of his works are quite close to the musical progress of the time. His successor include Walter Braunfels, who mainly emerged as an opera composer, and the symphonist Wilhelm Furtwängler. The opera stage was particularly suitable for increased emotions. The folk and fairy tale operas of Engelbert Humperdinck, Wilhelm Kienzlo, and Siegfried Wagner, the son of Richard Wagner, were still quite good. But even Eugen d'Albert and Max von Schillings irritated the nerves with a German variant of verism. Erotic symbolism can be found in the stage works of Alexander von Zemlinsky and Franz Schreker. Richard Strauss went even further to the limits of tonality with Salome and Elektra before he took more traditional paths with Der Rosenkavalier. In the style related to the works of Strauss, the compositions of Emil von Reznicek and Paul Greener are shown. In Italy, opera still dominated during this time. This is where verism developed, an exaggerated realism that could easily turn into the striking and melodramatic on the opera stage. Despite their extensive work, Ruggero Leoncavallo, Pietro Mascagni, Francesco Cilia, and Umberto Giordano have only become known through one opera at a time. Only Giacomo Puccini's work has been completely preserved in the repertoire of the opera houses, although he was also often accused of sentimentality. Despite some veristic works, Erminio Wolf-Ferrari was mainly considered a revival of the opera buffa. Ferruccio Busoni, a temporarily defender of modern classicity living in Germany, left behind a rather conventional, little-played work. Thus, instrumental music actually only found its place in Italian music again with Ottorino Respighi, who was influenced by Impressionism. The term Impressionism comes from painting, and like there, it also developed in music in France. In the works of Claude Debussy, the structures dissolved into the finest nuances of rhythm, dynamics, and timbre. This development was prepared in the work of Vincent d'Indy, Ernest Chausson, and above all in the songs and chamber music of Gabriel Fauré. All subsequent French composers were more or less influenced by Impressionism. The most important among them was Maurice Ravel, a brilliant orchestral virtuoso. Albert Roussel first processed exotic topics before he anticipated neoclassical tendencies like Ravel. Gabriel Péron, Paul Dukas, Charles Koechlin, and Florent Schmidt also dealt with symbolic and exotic oriental substances. The loner Erik Satie was the creator of spun piano pieces and idol of the next generation. Nevertheless, Impressionism is often attributed to the epoch of modernity, if not seen as its own epoch. Hubert Parry and the Irishman Charles Villiers Stanford initiated late Romanticism in England, which had its first important representative in Edward Elgar. While he revived the oratorio and wrote symphonies and concerts, Frederick Delius devoted himself to particularly small orchestral images with his own variant of Impressionism. Ethel Smith wrote mainly operas and chamber music in a style that reminded Brahms. Ralph Vaughan Williams, whose works were inspired by English folk songs and Renaissance music, became the most important symphonist of his country. Gustav Holst incorporated Greek mythology and Indian philosophy into his work. Very idiosyncratic composer personalities in the transition to modernity were also Havergal Brian and Frank Bridge. In Russia, Alexander Glazunov decorated his traditional composition technique with a colorful orchestral palette. The mystic Alexander Scriabin dreamed of a synthesis of colors, sound and sense. Sergei Rachmaninoff wrote melancholic pathetic piano pieces and concertos full of intoxicating virtuosity, while the piano works of Nikolai Metner are more lyrical. In the Czech Republic, Leos Janáček, deeply rooted in the music of his Moravian homeland, found new areas of expression with the development of the language melody in his operas. The local sounds are also unmistakable in the music of Zdeněk Fibiš, Josef Bohuslav Forster, Vítězslav Novak, and Joseph Suk. On the other hand, there is a slightly morbid exoticism and later classicist measure in the work of the Polish Karol Szymanowski. The most important Danish composer is Carl Nielsen, known for symphonies and concerts. Even more dominant in his country is the position of the Finn Jean Sibelius, also a symphonist of melancholy expressiveness and clear line design. In Sweden, the works of Wilhelm Petersen Berger, Wilhelm Stenhammar, and Hugo Alfvén show a typical Nordic conservatism, and the Norwegian Christian Sinding also composed traditionally. The music of Spain also increased in popularity again after a long time, first in the piano works of Isaac Albeniz and Enrique Granados, then in the operas, ballets, and orchestral works of Manuel de Falla, influenced by Impressionism. Finally, the first important representatives of the United States also appeared with Edward MacDowell and Amy Beach. But even the work of Charles Ives belonged only partly to late Romanticism, much of it was already radically modern and pointed far into the 20th century. The New German School was a loose collection of composers and critics informally led by Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner, who strove for pushing the limits of chromatic harmony and program music as opposed to absolute music, which they believed had reached its limit under Ludwig van Beethoven. This group also pushed for the development and innovation of the symphonic poem, thematic transformation in musical form, and radical changes in tonality and harmony. Other important members of this movement includes the critic Richard Pohl and composers Felix Draesek, Julius Rubka, Karl Klindworth, William Mason, and Peter Cornelius. The conservatives were a broad group of musicians and critics who maintained the artistic legacy of Robert Schumann, who adhered to composing and promoting absolute music. They believed in continuing along the footsteps of Ludwig van Beethoven of composing the symphony genre in the classical mold, though they would implement their own musical language. The most prominent members of this circle were Johannes Brahms, Joseph Joachim, Clara Schumann, and the Leipzig Conservatoire, which had been founded by Felix Mendelssohn. The Mighty Five were a group of Russian composers centered in St. Petersburg who collaborated with each other from 1856 to 1870 to create a distinctly Russian national style of classical music. They were often at odds with Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who favored a more Western approach to classical composition. Led by Mily Balakirev, the group's main members also consisted of Cesar Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Alexander Borodin. The Believ Circle was a society of Russian musicians who met in St. Petersburg from 1885 and 1908, who sought to continue the development of the national Russian style of classical music, following in the footsteps of the Mighty Five, although they were far more tolerant of the Western compositional style of Tchaikovsky. This group was founded by Russian music publisher philanthropist Mitrofan Believ. The two most important composers of this group were Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and Alexander Glazunov. Members also included Vladimir Stasov, Anatoly Lyadov, Alexander Osovsky, Witold Malisowski, Nikolai Cherepnin, Nikolai Sokolov, and Alexander Winkler. During the later half of the 19th century, some prominent composers began exploring the limits of the traditional tonal system. Important examples include Tristan und Isolde by Richard Wagner and Bagatelle sans Tonalite by Franz Liszt. This limit was finally reached during the late Romantic period, where progressive tonality is demonstrated in the works of composers such as Gustav Mahler. With these developments, Romanticism finally began to break apart into several new parallel movements forming in response, bringing way to modernism. Some notable movements to form in response to Romanticism's collapse include Expressionism with Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School being its main promoters, and Primitivism with Igor Stravinsky being its most influential composer.